Hello everyone, and welcome to our special webinar, Enabling Women's Economic Security in 2022 and Beyond. I'm Dina Bowman, Principal Research Fellow, Work and Economic Security at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waterways from which we meet. We pay our respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and emerging. I particularly acknowledge the many lands from which we have gathered today. I'm speaking to you from Wadawurrung country in regional Victoria, and our panellists come from Gadigal country, Awabakal land, Wurundjeri country and Bundjalung country. I have with me today Tyson and Megan, our Auslan interpreters for today. Closed captioning is available by clicking the icon CC at the bottom of the screen. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website after today. If you have a question during the event for our panellists, please use the Q&A button, which is available on the bottom of the screen. We have a lot of people dialed in, so we may not be able to answer all the questions due to the limited time we have, but we'll try our best. The chat feature is also on if you wish to make any comments or join in the conversation. And if you're tweeting, and we encourage you to do so, please use the hashtag BSL Talks and please tag @BrotherhoodInfo. And those details are going to be popped in the chat. For those of you new to the work of the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, we're a social justice organisation working alongside people experiencing disadvantage to address the fundamental causes of poverty in Australia. Our mission and work is directly informed by people experiencing poverty and disadvantage, using evidence drawn from our research and program experience to develop practical solutions to create positive, lasting change. So why focus on women's economic security? The facts are well known, but bear repeating. The gender pay gap persists. In 2022, it's 13.8%, which means that women on average earn less than $255.30 less than men each week. Women continue to earn less than men because they are more likely to work in part-time and low-paid jobs. Employed women are almost 3 times more likely than men to be working part-time. For parents whose youngest dependent child was under 6, 3 in 5, or 60%, of employed mothers work part-time compared to less than 10% of fathers. Female graduates' starting salaries are 4.9% lower than male graduate starting salaries, widening to a gap of 15.8% 3 years later. And women comprise under a third of management positions and just over a quarter of directors. Over time, poverty accumulates. 34% of single Australian women over 60 live in income poverty, compared to 27% of men. And almost 60% of those accessing homelessness services are women. Women are often trapped in abusive relationships because they can't afford to leave. 2019 data showed women were 5 times more likely to be victims of sexual assault than men, and on average, one woman a week is murdered by her current or former partner. 2019, First Nations women are 34 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to be hospitalised due to family and domestic violence. 40% of women with disability have experienced physical violence after the age of 15, compared to 26% without disability. After countless reviews and inquiries, the issues and drivers are well known. So what's needed now and in the future? Let me introduce our panel of experts to go beyond just discussing the issues, to talk about some of the possible solutions and why it's so hard to make effective change. First of all, I'll introduce Professor Margaret Alston. Margaret is a Professor of Social Work in the School of Humanities, Creative Industries and Social Science at the University of Newcastle, and Professor Emerita at Monash University. In 2010, Margaret was awarded an Order of Australia medal for her services to social work and to rural women. Just if I'm pausing, it's to allow the Auslan interpreter to catch up. Next, we have Kristen O'Connell. Kristen is spokesperson for the Anti-Poverty Centre and speaks on behalf of millions of unemployed Australians living below the poverty line. Kristen founded the Anti-Poverty Centre after a stint at the Australian Unemployed Workers Union as an unwaged worker living below the poverty line on disability support pension. Kristen can speak from personal experience about the impact of cuts to social security payments. And finally, we have Dr. Leonora Riss. Leonora is a senior lecturer in economics at RMIT University and a research fellow with the Women's Leadership Institute Australia. Leonora has completed a residency fellowship at Harvard University, where she was a research fellow with the Women and Public program in the Kennedy School of Government. Leonora's interest and research expertise is in gender equality, the labour market, disadvantage and wellbeing, demographics, education, and the use of psychology to understand economic outcomes. We have a fabulous panel and we're looking forward to a lively discussion. So let's get started. First to you, Leonora. As an economist, what do you see as the most pressing issues for women now and in the future?
Thank you, Dina, and thank you for the opportunity to join you on this wonderful panel on such a critical issue. I'm joining you today from Bungalang country, the traditional lands of the Yugambeh people here in southeast Queensland. The question that you've asked is a really big question. And as an economist, what I can share with you here is a reminder that economic security for women is about much more than just finances. Often we think about economics as pay, income, retirement savings, having a roof over your head. That's all essential. But economics is actually broader. It's about well-being, quality of life, and it's also about decision-making. So I mention that because when we think about women's economic security and what are the key and most pressing issues, we have to think broader. It's also about women having autonomy, having genuine choice over their decisions, and having a voice in decision-making, whether it's at the household level, the community level, or government level. And this means that we need a holistic approach. When not just talking about economic participation, we need to talk about the quality of work, dignity at work, and as we've seen, particularly in recent years, safety and respect for women at work and at all parts of society. So I mentioned that because we need that big picture approach, because so many of these dimensions are interlinking. And if we focus just on one or two issues, we won't arrive at the goals that we're seeking, which is, genuine gender equality and equal status and equal respect for women. And also taking this approach means that it steers us towards understanding that the root cause for so many of these gender inequities, and the statistics that you shared very powerfully at the start of this session, when we trace it back, we can see that it stems from a cultural problem, a cultural attitude where women are treated differently to men. And that's embedded in our systems, our policies, and our institutional structures. So we do need to be focusing on shifting those at a fundamental level. There are so many examples, but some key examples are the tax and transfer and childcare system that makes it financially unviable for women to work full-time in many cases. Now, that means that outcome is not a choice, a genuine choice. It's a constrained choice. It's being constrained by the system. And it's also about these cultural norms that prescribe certain roles for women compared to men. Who can blame women for not wanting to enthusiastically step into a traditionally male area such as construction or tech or politics, knowing and anticipating she's more likely to be overlooked, to not be taken seriously, and to be subject to harassment and abuse? It's those cultural barriers that we need to break through. When women reach retirement, and we see an increasing proportion of older women facing poverty and homelessness because they have dedicated their lives towards raising a family and have been in low-paid jobs. This is not an outcome by choice. This is a constrained choice because we know the system has given rise to those circumstances for those women. And many of the barriers and biases we're talking about here, we know are amplified and compounded by further characteristics and experiences, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, women with a disability, women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and regional areas, LGBTQI women and individuals, and new migrants. And this spotlights the importance of an intersectional approach. And finally, your question about what are the most pressing issues for the future, I think we need to be incredibly vigilant about becoming complacent and expecting progress to be linear. We've seen throughout the pandemic and internationally a regression in women's human rights in many cases. And we saw that the women in Australia were the shock absorbers for the economic impact of the pandemic. And that tells us that progress on gender equality and women's economic security is not guaranteed, and it's not linear. And in fact, there are many examples where, as women's economic opportunities and women's economic empowerment improves, we actually see retaliation and resistance and backlash occur. And so we need to be mindful about assuming that just as we make progress, that there aren't any potential costs or penalties associated with that as well. There are examples in Australia where research has shown that as a woman begins to earn more than her male partner, so becomes the primary breadwinner, her likelihood of experiencing domestic and emotional abuse actually increases because it's disrupting this male breadwinner, female caregiver norm. So in sum, when we talk about the most pressing issues, we need to be focusing on the cultural norms and the institutionalized systemic barriers that are really blocking the road to pure and genuine gender equity.
Thanks, Leonora. That was a most comprehensive explanation of why it's so hard to affect change, because, as you say, progress isn't linear, and there is resistance to change. I'm going to turn now to Kristen, who perhaps can hone in on some of the issues that Leonora has raised, particularly from your perspective in relation to women and social security. So what do you think are the key issues in relation to social security, Kristen?
Thank you, Dina. I'll start by acknowledging the elders of the Sovereign Gadigal people, the rightful owners of the land I'm on, and the First Nations folks who are here today. I ask everyone to keep front of mind in this discussion and with what I'm saying that First Peoples are subject to ongoing colonial violence across all facets of society, and particularly in the racist, carceral and welfare systems. So it's a big question. I won't be able to cover very much, but I'll do my best. The social security system is designed to be a poverty machine, and it's hard to fathom the horror of trying to survive in it if you haven't had to yourself. It amounts to systemic abuse and it hurts everyone, but everything that I'm going to talk about disproportionately harms women, but also non-binary folks, and even more so Black, disabled, formerly incarcerated, migrants, other people whose marginalisation is intersectional. So I've tried to cover some of this in an article that came out on Tuesday as well, which is a bit more detailed. And you can take a look at that if you want to understand a little bit more about what I'm going to be talking about. I'm just going to try and pop things in the chat as I go, although I should do that for everyone, not just the hosts. So there we go. So I call our welfare system the poverty machine because how the innumerable parts of it work together not only trap people in poverty, but it really brutalizes and punishes women for their poverty and for not being in paid employment at all, or for being in low paid employment, which Dina, you already pointed out is really prevalent. So before I get into some detail on that, I want to highlight what I think is a fundamental problem, and that is that social policy debate and discussion doesn't sit with the women who are affected, either by the existing policies or the proposals that are put forward by professional advocates, academics, commentators, politicians, the media, everyone who talks about us to address the harms that we experience. So it's hard to know where to start when talking about misogyny and violence in the welfare system. Some of the worst programs I think most folks hopefully have heard of, like Parents Next and income control, such as the cashless debit card, specifically target women. There's also mutual obligations, which don't just mean being forced to do punishing, harmful, demeaning and pointless activities. The system doesn't reward or even recognise women for the incalculable unpaid work that they do. So that work isn't recognised, meaning that those requirements don't adequately account for caring responsibilities. You'll be cut off your poverty payment entirely if you turn down a job or leave a job. About 250,000 people on unemployment payments are actually employed, and they don't earn enough to get out of poverty. So all of this means if you're bullied, harassed, assaulted in any of these environments, you're trapped. A job agency caseworker literally said to one of our members of the Anti-Poverty Centre, "You belong to us." And Alicia wrote a brilliant article about that, which I'm going to also pop in the chat now. Sorry, I've lost my spot. You can imagine her distress. And I mean, she was trying to resolve a problem that was caused by her caseworker incorrectly penalising her for something that didn't happen. So there are incredibly complex interactions between the harmful things in the system, from living in poverty to these mutual obligations, trying to understand and navigate Centrelink and Department of Employment requirements and systems. But the system itself harms women in how it interacts with policies beyond social security and affects people who aren't on payments, like those in casualised work, people with the wrong visa type, people who can't access the documentation they need to qualify for a payment, which of course puts people in violent homes at particular risk. When Centrelink arbitrarily decides you can't work more than 8 hours a week, most of which happens to folks with intellectual disability, they send you off to a sheltered workshop where you earn as little as $2 an hour. And we know that closed environments are breeding grounds for sexual and other forms of abuse for people with disability. 90% of women with intellectual disability have experienced sexual abuse. So the social security system locks people into unsafe home environments, but it also increases some of the factors that contribute to and increase the likelihood of family violence, like financial strain and financial dependency. Partner and parental income tests mean that women, trans folks, disabled people can't escape. The job seeker payment gets cut off completely if you're in a relationship once your partner earns the equivalent to $55,000 a year. So you have to leave before you can get it. So the way the poverty machine is operating means millions of women, we're talking about millions of women, do not have the resources to keep themselves safe, and hundreds of thousands of people are already unsafe right now. So people in financial hardship reported unwanted sexual activity at 3 times the overall rate. That is 16% compared to 5.6%. In 2019, more than 60,000 women between the ages just of 15 and 24 experienced moderate to high levels, to very high levels of financial hardship and violence in the preceding year. So nearly 8,000 women each year are returning to their abuser due to the risk of homelessness, and more than 9,000 survivors of violence actually become homeless. It's a Byzantine system, and I have not even covered the tip of the iceberg really, but it goes some way to showing how it is that the welfare system is hurting women and trans folks, and indeed it literally is killing people. This is why I think there's absolutely no excuse for not making the fight to make the welfare system humane the top issue when we are talking about the campaign for all women's equality, safety and economic security. There's absolutely no excuse. And I don't think most people in this room need to be convinced of that, but there are a lot of people outside this room who do.
Thanks, Kristen. And I think what's come out from both you and Leonora is the importance of an intersectional lens, not only in terms of social structures of inequality, but the policies that affect people's lives. I'm going to turn now to Margaret, who's got a particular interest in rural and regional women. What are the increased risks associated with climate change, and how do these particularly affect women in regional and rural Australia?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm coming to you from the Wagga lands around Newcastle, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and future and emerging. Okay, I wanted to pick up on a few things actually, but let's talk about climate change, because quite often climate disasters will happen in rural areas. If you think about the flooding, the current flooding, you think about the bushfires, and you think about the lengthy drought that we had at the turn of the century, then you can see that these disasters tend to be focused, or more specifically are focused in rural areas. And apologies to the people of Sydney who are currently experiencing flooding. So what does climate disasters mean for, certainly for people in those particular areas, but also for women? Now, I've been doing research around these issues for far too long, actually, decades, and both here in Australia, but also overseas in various countries where it is very obvious to me that disasters have a particular gendered impact. And what I'm talking about there are things like the fact that climate changes are impacting on lives and livelihood and basic human amenity. And then there are particular challenges for rural areas like higher mortality and mobility and morbidity, and loss of housing, loss of businesses, flow-on effects to income security, etc. And currently people around Lismore having to prove who they are, that they're eligible for certain benefits. Now, how does that impact women particularly? What we've found in our research around disasters and climate change is that there are particular gendered impacts, including often a rise in violence, homelessness, a need for women to leave their workplace because they've got a larger caring role, problems with insurance, problems with rebuilding, and so forth. So there are particular gendered impacts, and the people who are currently suffering from disaster, I really want to acknowledge that there are issues going on there. But moving away from climate and disasters, issues that impact women in rural and regional areas will include things like a lack of employment opportunities, and sometimes this will mean women having to move away to access work. The work that they can access in rural communities might be part-time, insecure, low paid, etc. But at the same time, we've had this process throughout Australia where the loss of public services in these communities has meant the loss of professional jobs, and often these jobs are the jobs that are done by women. So the loss of public service jobs, healthcare jobs, education services, schools closed down, TAFEs closed down. That means that the jobs that women traditionally did are no longer there, and that may mean that women have to leave home to get employment. And meanwhile, the closure of TAFEs and training centres in small communities had a huge impact on the capacity of young people and young women to actually achieve the skills they need. For young people, I just want to mention young people. I did some research with some young rural women some time ago, but they were talking about the income security process whereby they have to apply for a certain number of jobs each month. I'm not particularly familiar with what number it is now, but if you're in a rural community, as one of them said, you can only go to the cafe and ask them to sign your document so many times. And so that is a particular issue. And then having to front up to a Centrelink office or a Service New South Wales office to show intent is often really, really difficult for rural communities, rural women, etc. It might mean an overnight stay in a city and so forth, and so they tend to drop out of receiving benefits because of the cruel system that is in place. So at the same time, I wanted to mention also the lack of services that has significant repercussions for women, not just in employment, but then access to things like healthcare and aged care, mental health care. They've had huge impacts for women. One of the things I'm researching at the moment is the closure of birthing services in rural areas, which means that many women in rural and remote areas are giving birth on the sides of lonely country roads as they try to reach regional centralised hospitals. Now, these sort of experiences are really rebounding on women's wanting to go to these areas, but then their experiences when they're there. And meanwhile, the last point I want to make is the lack of access to internet services in these areas also has significant implications in terms of things like accessing healthcare, education, employment opportunities, but also family and so forth, and that increases social isolation. So quite a few things that I mentioned there that hopefully are useful in terms of this discussion.
Thank you, Margaret. Again, bringing back to the idea of intersections. It's the intersection of place, which is important too, that you've raised for rural and regional women. Leonora, now we know that we've had a discussion about some of the challenges. So what can and should be done to tackle persistent gender inequality?
Thanks, Dina. Kristen and Margaret have provided some really powerful and important examples of how women can experience different impacts to men as a result of policy settings and economic shocks and climate change shocks, for instance. And one way of addressing that is to build in a mechanism in our policy-making processes where we apply a gender lens as part of the standardised process of analysing impacts, designing policy mechanisms and responding to unexpected shocks. And so we call it gender lensing, and you'll see internationally within the UN, within the OECD, this process of applying a gender impact assessment has been recognised as best practice in an economic policy sense, but also as a human rights matter as well. And we really don't do that in a routine way in Australia. Instead, we analyse these gender patterned impacts after the fact, after we see all these gender gaps in outcomes and these awful statistics, and we can trace it back to the fact that the policies are designed in a way that don't account for these differences. So I think raising awareness about the value of instilling gender lensing into government decision making from federal, state right through to local level, as well as within corporate decision making or investment decision making, whenever decisions are being made, is possible to make it similar to an environmental impact assessment, to anticipate and forecast and invest in that initial step of considering how men and women and different cohorts of women will be affected differently. In terms of economic policy, this gender lensing is called gender responsive budgeting. Now, if we had had gender responsive budgeting in action when we had the government formulating its response to the pandemic, we probably would have arrived at a very different set of policy responses. Some examples are the government tending to rely on infrastructure announcements, propping up male-dominated jobs in construction, in trades, as part of their sort of go-to response for when we have an economic shock. Now, that's great for people in those jobs, but we know there's a gender pattern there that means women's jobs were less likely to be supported. We saw JobKeeper withdrawn from childcare workers, which is a female-dominated sector, obviously. And also what we're probably going to see now when we have these climate change disasters, you'll see the government response will be very much focused on building back in terms of physical infrastructure. Now, it's absolutely critical that that infrastructure is rebuilt in a resilient and adaptive way, but it also means we need to be thinking about, well, what about the female dominated sectors here, like mental health care provision and childcare provision and nursing? Are they going to see the same amount of government resources channeled towards those sectors in response to these disasters? If we have a gender lens, that puts the radar up to build in accountability into the system to make sure that that taxpayer money effectively is being distributed equitably across our population, as well as obviously meeting the needs of what's required in those responses. If we have a gender lensing approach, some other examples are we would see that women are more likely to rely on the public transport system, particularly in those regional areas, as Margaret has mentioned, meaning that they are disproportionately more likely to suffer when public transport services are disrupted or are wound back. The example of mutual obligation requirements that Kristen mentioned certainly have this gender dimension to it. In addition to what Kristen has mentioned, it's actually harder to undertake those mutual obligation requirements when you have caregiving responsibilities. So there is a gender pattern there, even though it's not written into the policy. Job application criteria, as Kristen's also alluded to, generally don't recognise the skills, the competencies, the professional social networks and social capital that women bring from volunteer community services or from unpaid work, or interruptions in their CV could be perceived negatively in the eyes of prospective employers, and that's a reflection of women giving more on average to unpaid work that service not being recognised when it comes to job eligibility. And when we talk about a gender lens, this is also about applying an intersectional gender lens. And one of the barriers there is also a deficiency in data. And I know that there are organisations like the Commission, the Victorian Commission for Gender Equality, that is focusing on how can we collect that intersectional data, keeping in mind it needs to be done ethically, sensitively, responsibly. But then that really helps to fortify the case for designing policies with this gender lens in mind. And I mean, the other part of my answer here, what can be done to tackle persistent gender inequality? I think where we're really not focusing enough on is understanding resistance to change. So you can put forward the most compelling argument or a business case for, yes, this is why we need gender equality. This is why diversity is good for an organisation or good for the economy. And yet, if we have such a strong case and such a compelling case, why are we not seeing genuine change, or we're only seeing tinkering at the margins rather than deep and authentic reform? And I think we need to spend a lot more focus on understanding sources of resistance to change. And I think this is going to come up as your third question, so I'll pause there. But I've got potentially a little bit more to expand on in that area as well.
Yeah, thanks, Leonora. Again, that kind of intersectional perspective coming through and the need for a gender lens. Kristen, from your perspective, adopting a gender lens, what key changes are required to make the social security system fairer all round, but fairer for women?
Burn it down. Get rid of everything to do with it and start again, I would say, just to sum it up. But just before I give a bit more context for that, to pick up on Leonora's point just about MOs there, it's not just harder to juggle everything in your life while you're being punished with them. We had a study out in the last year or so that showed they actually stop people getting work, and you get worse jobs, they last shorter, and they're lower paid. So they actively get in the way of the things, as with many programs, the government says these things are designed to do. So I would start by saying we need to stop the cycle of poverty at its source. Some folks might have seen out today in the conversation, and again, I'll actually just drop this in the chat, piece about child poverty and the effects of that. And it resonated very strongly with me. I grew up in a single parent family with 3 kids living on Centrelink payments, but it didn't even go into the psychological effects of the shame and the stigma that you experience. So poverty is harming everyone who's being forced to live in it, but it's having these horrible effects for children, and they're in many cases lifelong effects, and they follow us into adulthood. So women need freedom and security to leave bad and unsafe jobs, which means, like COVID illustrated, I think you touched on it earlier, Dina, how heavy the burden is on women when hundreds of thousands of people who were in feminized industries and working in low paid jobs were excluded from the JobKeeper payment because of the type of employment that they had. Women's work needs to be recognised and defined more broadly. So that caring labour component is so important. I think we need to stop fetishizing paid work. We need to get away from outdated ideas like the dignity of work, and we actually need to value the unpaid work that is happening everywhere in our society. Women need autonomy and they need independence, as Leonora has said. Your family situation should not have any bearing on your access to payments or how much it is. And for folks who fear that rich people will start accessing payments, I can guarantee you, A, people don't like the stigma of having to access income support, but also no rich person is going to bother dealing with Centrelink just for the sake of a poverty payment, even if we doubled that payment. It is not, in my view, a problem that we would need to face. The partner income test is punishing people for being in a relationship, and I've heard it described by disability advocates as meaning there's no marriage equality for disabled people. And I would expand that out and say it blocks relationship equality for all people who rely on Centrelink payments because you hesitate. You question the risk of finding yourself in a stable relationship, and that Centrelink decides you're in a relationship and they cut off your payment. My colleague Jay Coonan, who was hurt by this rule himself, recently wrote about it and wrote about how it interacts with the government's disturbing surveillance practices. When we speak about psychological impacts, that's really enormous as well. So the government has to stop reproducing the tactics of coercive control. Income control has an enormous impact on women, and I call it income control because income management is sinister framing for something that absolutely, insidiously controls your life. It was designed by a billionaire, Andrew Forrest, and the government claims its purpose is to reduce family violence. But over the period that the cashless debit card has been in place in trial communities, and we're talking about a so-called trial that's been going on now for close to 8 years, with no evidence, just continually extended, we've seen rates of family violence go up. It shames people who have to use it, and it shames kids who are excluded from participating in activities that involve cash or expenditure on things that aren't approved to be spent on in the card. So the system needs to also recognise barriers to employment for Black folks, disabled people, trans folks are actually deeply rooted in the compounding effects of discrimination in the labour market. So we can't allow the social security system to continue punishing people for things that are beyond our control, including the fact that governments actively seek to keep hundreds of thousands of people unemployed as part of macroeconomic policy. So there are many areas of policy, for example, pay equity, that need solutions targeted to women. But in my view, it's the opposite when we talk about social security. Targeted programs exclude the most disadvantaged people. We see it with rent assistance, which really, in my view, needs to be scrapped. What we need to support and protect women and trans folks is a universal solution. Income support available to everyone who needs it without restriction. Payments immediately lifted to the Henderson poverty line while we do the work of designing a fit for purpose measure of poverty, because that one's more than 50 years old now, and complete abolition of compulsory mutual obligations. That sort of transformation will benefit every woman, every child, and every person who experiences gendered violence, not just those in the welfare system. So we need to rethink what feminism looks like. In many ways, it's become insipid and disempowering, and I've seen many women expressing exasperation and illusionment with it with International Women's Day this year, and I felt it too. We need to energise the movement and no more morning teas and donating to charities, and instead have really ambitious goals about advancing the rights of women. There's space for everyone, but we shouldn't be centering on people who are better off. If you're in stable employment and not earning the same as your male peers, that's important, and we should address it, but it shouldn't be the priority. We can walk and chew gum. We need to understand there are millions of women whose safety, who are just not safe, or whose safety is under threat because of the design of the poverty machine and their exposure to the welfare system or their inability to access it. And that is why I think it just has to be totally rebuilt.
Thanks, Kristen. It's a transformational change isn't easy, but it's always good to have that as an ambition. So Margaret, what do you think could even up the odds for women in rural and regional areas, having heard what Kristen and Leonora had said? Margaret, you're on mute. No, Margaret, you need to turn your microphone on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. No, I found the two speakers really refreshing in the various ideas they were postulating. I like the idea of gender lensing or gender mainstreaming. That's something that I've been pushing for a long time, so I totally support that idea. And Kristen's powerful advocacy of a universal wage or something similar was very good to hear. So congratulations to both of you. In rural areas, obviously things can be so much more complex because of access issues, because of the lack of employment possibilities, because of there's a certain culture often in rural communities that may be quite masculinized in because of population profile, whatever, but that also has repercussions in terms of who might be employed in certain businesses and, you know, what is available to women in these communities. I want to push this barrow if I can, and that's about access to internet services, which, you know, quite apart from the issues raised by the previous speakers, which I wholly endorse, this is a particular issue in relation to rural areas, and I'm pushing it a bit. But if there was access to internet services across the country, then that would improve things like service access and social interactions. And indeed, the point that I wanted to make is about the options that it might open up for working from home for women in rural communities. Now, we've had COVID, we've had working from home now universally tested across the country. And my question and my challenge is, why can't we continue to do that by employing rural, you know, really skilled rural women into city businesses and so forth? And, you know, it's tested now. Why can't we do that? Because that would open up enormous opportunities, not only for women, obviously, but I'm focusing on women. So having that option of working from home, but then of course the issue of the wiping out of services and jobs across many rural communities is something that we need to challenge. And I took heart from Kristen's passion about her position, and I feel quite passionate about this too. The fact that we need to reintroduce services into rural communities, not only because of the service they provide, but the employment opportunities. And then issues around accessing benefit and the complexities around that are really important to change the rural agenda, as it were, so that people aren't dropping off unemployment because they simply can't meet the guidelines, and therefore they've disappeared. They're not in the numbers, and we forget about them, or certainly governments can forget about them very easily. And I think that's a real challenge that we need to address in terms of policy. We need to address things like the training needs of rural and remote young people in these communities that are quite isolated, because currently there aren't many opportunities. Access to social housing is as important in rural communities as it is in cities, and that's something, again, that I would strongly advocate for. I think we need to have a much stronger and more visible look at coming back to climate changes, because I think it was where we kicked off in terms of what I was saying. More visibility around what's happening in these communities, more recognition of the unpaid work that's being done to resurrect these communities. And, you know, it's a challenge to actually reframe how we see what's going on in communities that have been absolutely decimated. So I have some concluding remarks, which I could give you now, or I could do them later.
I think we might just go to the final question to all of our panellists, and thank you, Margaret. You know, we've heard some of the issues, we've heard what needs to be done. So what are the challenges to achieving change? And I might start with you, Margaret, and then we can go around. We haven't got long, so if you could...
Yeah, I can see the time slipping away, so I'll be quick. I think we need to address policy inertia in the way it actually views Australian citizens, regardless of gender. But then I also think that we need to address the misogyny that's very, very evident in relation to government policy around this area. How else can you describe a lack of action on issues such as childcare and the lack of birthing services in rural communities? So misogyny seems to be embedded in a lot of policies. There are ongoing cultural issues and a lack of women in government, and cultural issues, I think, in both major parties about the policies that they tend to prioritise. So it would be so refreshing if we could follow Leonora's beautiful ideas around gender lensing and produce policies that are actually relevant to the people in our communities. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. I might turn to Kristen next. What are the challenges to change?
To build on what Margaret just said, I think things are being made much more difficult because we're seeing the gutting of public services from healthcare, public housing, education, public transport. And all of those basic needs are becoming more expensive, which means it's harder for those of us in the system to fight for our rights because there's like this dramatically increasing gap between payments and the poverty line. And every time that happens, it means we're spending more time and more energy just to survive because it takes a lot of time and energy and hard work to be poor. We do not have self-determination for First Peoples, and that is essential. It's such a basic principle and it shouldn't be controversial in the slightest, but also it's illogical. We have communities who are affected in far more complex ways than colonizers like myself, and they have the expertise that is needed to address challenges. They just need to be resourced and supported as well. One of, I think, well, probably the biggest challenge is politicians. They are actively blocking improvement and they're ignoring advocates, they're ignoring research, they're ignoring every bit of evidence that is put in front of them. We don't need more evidence. And I think Leonora picked up on this earlier. This stuff is widely known now. We need more pressure. We need to have a new approach to how we engage with politicians and lobbying and public campaigning, because being nice to them and trying to be their friend and trying to get them to listen to us has not worked. It has failed. So we need bigger social movements, and we need to draw on the experience of people who deal with the realities of poverty. So I do want to reiterate what I touched on earlier and send a particularly strong message and call to action to everyone here, that people hurt by the welfare system are the real experts. And many of you may have a lot of knowledge about these systems, but unless you're among us who have lived in it long term, I don't think you can grasp its nature. I see it as an extraordinary barrier to progress because we're setting ambitions low, as we touched on earlier. We're oversimplifying things. Research is so narrow that it doesn't actually account for the compounding effect of all of the parts of the poverty machine. So in terms of what the community sector is pushing for in terms of change right now, I think it is that in itself is a problem, and that problem is rooted in the fact in who's leading those lobbying efforts. So we feel under attack from all sides, and that's why we have intrinsic knowledge of how the parts of the poverty machine interact and hold us back and hold us down. Those of us who live it have the most sophisticated solutions. We're studied like zoo animals, but we're not in control of those studies. Whenever I have the opportunity, I try to involve other people in the types of spaces I get access to. And recently I co-chaired a DSS working group on reviewing disability employment services. And I had to push to get people who are in DES involved in that. And they weren't given the prominence they deserved, but those who were able to be included contributed the most specific and important insights. And all of the professionals in the room agreed with that. The whole field needs to be reoriented to allow us to lead, not just to be involved and to have agency and to be in control. It is excellent that there are researchers who can work on this stuff and help with it. But I think we'd all agree on anything to do with policies affecting women, it would be untenable for conversations to be led by men. And we can see who's on the panel today. So like that, I think it should be untenable for conversations about people in poverty to be led by those who aren't. Nothing about us without us.
Thanks, Kristen. Tiny amount of time left, Leonora. So if you can briefly just give us your thoughts about, what's the challenge to change?
Sure, thank you. And thank you. I feel really impassioned by everything I've just heard from Kristen and Margaret. Look, in summary, what's the challenge? People in power and privilege currently benefit from the status quo. What they're going to be giving up in their eyes is not worth the gains. So, that's ultimately our roadblock here. So we are talking about the social movement, cultural change, institutionalizing accountability through gender lensing. May I also acknowledge the work done by civil society and community groups such as the National Foundation for Australian Women, who take it upon themselves voluntarily to invest in gender lensing in the absence of the government doing it. We can support those processes as well. The research shows resistance stems from people who are keen to maintain the status quo, who value traditionalism, conservatism. We need to call it out and demonstrate that we are talking about, I think, a human rights issue here as well. I think there's limited use in pursuing a business case proposal when we are talking about human rights and lived experience. And I think that's an important part of complementing the data, the evidence base. And I love that Kristen has brought that voice to our discussion today. That lived experience is what really gets to the heart of what needs to change. I'd like to end on a positive note. We have an example in Victoria of the Commission for Gender Equality building in gender responsive budgeting and gender lensing within the state government. So that is an example that progress can be achieved. Yes, more needs to be done, but this is promising that there are examples of progressive governments in Australia. Australia used to do this back in the 1980s. They used to have gender lensing at a federal level. It was dismantled over time. I think we need to put the pressure on, raise awareness, equip people with that knowledge and power to complement lived experience. So it is about, collectively joining forces here.
Thanks, Leonora. What a fabulous discussion. And it's a pity we've run out of time, so we haven't got time for questions. But I'm sure that people would be on the panel would be willing to respond if you sent them through. What this discussion, I think, has really emphasised is the importance of a gender lens, adequate universal services, and obviously an fair and adequate social security system, policies to support inclusive employment, and the need to shift persistent cultural attitudes about women. So let's keep this conversation going. You can use the hashtag BSL Talks. And next, to learn more about the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, you can hop on our website, bsl.org.au, and you can also see a recording of this webinar, which you can share with others if you like. Our next webinar is on the 7th of April and examines intergenerational equity issues. And I think the details are in the chat. So we've hit our time, and thanks so much to the panel and to the audience for this event. Thanks so much. Bye.